This is Regenerative Skills, the podcast helping you to learn the skills and solutions to create an abundant and connected future. I'm your host, Oliver Gaucher. Through their diverse range of publications, New Society Publishers' books explore topics that are at the forefront of creating positive change in our world. From regenerative agriculture and permaculture to social justice and eco-conscious living, their books cover a wide spectrum of subjects that empower readers to lead more regenerative and fulfilling lives. Now, whether you're a seasoned environmentalist, a curious beginner, or someone simply seeking inspiration and guidance on your journey towards regenerative living, New Society Publishers is here to support you every step of the way. Now exclusively for listeners of this podcast, you can use the code SKILLS25 and receive a 25% discount on all ebooks at newsociety.com. That's all one word and lowercase, SKILLS25 on all ebooks. So level up your knowledge today at newsociety.com. Hey there everybody and welcome back. So continuing in the theme of last week's episode in which I spoke with Jessica Robertson about community forests, we're going to go deeper into the practical knowledge and the skills that anyone can develop to create their own plant nursery, propagate their favorite varieties, and get their own garden or food forest established quickly and cheaply. Joining me for this dive into DIY plant breeding and propagation is David Goodman, better known to his fans as David the Good. David is a gardening author and teacher, focusing on simple methods to grow the most food for the least amount of work. His blog can be found at thesurvivalgardener.com, and he's on YouTube as @DavidTheGood. In this discussion, we'll take a look at what concepts and realizations helped David to find success in his early gardening and growing endeavors, which he still uses to this day. David is a big proponent of setting up your own plant nursery, and we go into his advice for getting one set up cheaply so that you can save money from the garden centers and maybe even make some money with it as a side hustle. We also explore the process of selecting varieties and species that thrive in your area and your conditions, and the importance of building community through your planting and your breeding efforts. Now, I myself am in the process of setting up my own nursery and agroforestry system, and I can vouch for the importance of starting your own plants not only to save money, but also to learn a valuable skill and potentially even increase the quality of the plants that you have access to. So I'll hand things over now to David the Good. Welcome, David. Thanks so much for taking time to be on the show. It's great to connect with you after following a lot of your content and watching your YouTube channel for so long. How are you doing today?
I am doing great. Very glad to be here. It's spring here. Things are starting to wake up outside, so everything is well with the world at this moment.
Yeah, it's also the most exciting time of year for me too, because this is before I've made all of my mistakes later in the season that result in killing the things that are just starting to sprout now.
There's so much promise right now.
There's so much potential. Good. I haven't screwed it up yet.
I'm still in the infatuation stage.
That's right.
Yes.
Well, look, before we get into, all of these things that are sprouting and growing and how that relates to propagation and nurseries and all of that, let's start with your own background. How did you start out in gardening and growing food? What was your point of inspiration that led you to this point?
Well, I was not from a gardening family. My parents did not garden, and my grandparents did not really garden. I mean, my grandma would start avocado pits on the windowsill because she wanted an avocado tree in her backyard, and she would grow them until they were 2 or 3 feet tall, and then she would plant them out in the yard and they would die. And she did this multiple times because she didn't actually water them when they got out in the yard. She just stuck them in the backyard and they would die. So it was not really very promising. They had bought a house that had some fruit trees in it, and over time the fruit trees mostly died. Bit by bit, they gave up. They had a lot of fruit when I was little, and then when I got a little older, they had less fruit, and then they got sicker, and then, they just aged out and were not replaced. My grandparents loved people, my parents loved people, and plants were just not really on the radar, They always had people in and out. We had great big family meals and stuff, but where all those meals came from, it was definitely not from the yard. I had to go back all the way to my great grandparents to have anybody in the family that were gardeners, and they were in upstate New York. They came from a family that used to keep cows. They had cows all over this area, but it had kind of built up, and there were houses now, and cousins over here and uncles over here, and people scattered around this pond where they used to water all of their cows from. And so at that like when I actually got up to go and visit, I was probably 6 or 7 years old, and my great grandpa had a big quarter-acre garden in the backyard with this beautiful like red brown earth and just rows of potatoes, and then he had rows of blackberries and raspberries, and there were sunflowers that had self-seeded, and it was this little beautiful little wooden house that he and my great grandma lived in, and the big garden out back, and then my grandma would jar and can a lot of the stuff and put it up on the shelf. So it was kind of like going back in time to the 1940s to go to their house, and they were still living that way when I was little. And I thought that was pretty awesome. But I didn't really start to grow anything of my own until I was about 6. I was in kindergarten, and the teacher brought us all these little cups of dirt, and it was Bethany Christian School, and so it was this nice little private school and nice teachers and stuff. I did not fit in well at school at all. I ended up getting pulled from school later, but this worked. Had little cups of dirt, and she brought in a package of beans, and we planted the beans in the cups, and we took the cups home with us. And then in a week, she said that they would sprout. So they did. They sprouted in a week, and it was like magic. That little bean came up, and it separated in the little green. I didn't know they were called cotyledons back then, but I do now. And then the leaves started coming out of the center, and they grew. And I went, oh, this is so cool. So I got some pots in whatever containers I could find, and I filled them with sand from the backyard. I lived down in South Florida, so we had very sandy, it's like beach sand in the backyard. And I went through the pantry and my mom's dried beans, and I took all the dried beans that I could find, and I planted them in little pots, black beans and white beans and kidney beans and lima beans. My family didn't have a lot of money, so we had a lot of beans and rice, and so I started all these little things. The next year I was pulled out of school. They were going to make me repeat kindergarten because I was disruptive. I said I was not learning well, and I was not emotionally ready for first grade or something like that. So my mom's like, "No, I'm pulling him out because he's bored." And I really was. I just remember not enjoying it at all, not getting along well with the other kids. The hands-on sort of stuff like planting beans, that was the coolest thing that ever happened. The rest of it I didn't really like that much. My favorite time in school was when we would go out on the playground and I could go and catch toads and insects and that kind of thing. When I was sitting in the classroom, I just was not happy at all. And I think my mom realized it, so she pulled me out and homeschooled me. So sometime around that time between kindergarten and starting my first year of homeschool, I told my dad, I said, "Dad, I really want to have a garden of my own." And he said, "Well, all right. I'll figure something out for you." So the railroad tracks were getting pulled up near us, and they had these old railroad ties. So he got some railroad ties and brought them home. And he took 8-foot by 8-foot section of the back grass in the backyard, and he cut it out. And of course, it's just sand underneath. So we went down to Home Depot and bought bags of potting soil or whatever he got, and he put a little bit of black soil in a square for me. And I used some of my allowance money, and I bought seeds, and I started planting back there. And I had no idea what I was doing, and all I did was kill things. But at 6 or 7 years old, I was making little gardens in the backyard. And as I got older, I always had a garden every year, and I would stick different things back there, and it expanded to fill about a quarter of my parents' backyard. And it was not a very big backyard. We lived in suburbia. It was all, it's asphalt and tiny little houses right next to each other. Had the chain link fence around the backyard. It was very much in 1950s houses that were right on top of each other down in South Florida. And most people around there had palms that were ornamentals, not edibles, and they had St. Augustine grass, and it was kind of a lower working class neighborhood, which is now super, super expensive. I can't even afford to live in the neighborhood I grew up in. But back then it was just, they were cheap houses and small yards. So that's how I got started. And year after year, I basically killed plants in that backyard until I started to have some successes. I would get a few cucumbers here, or we get some lettuce there. I got different types of beans I would plant. Somebody gave me yard-long beans, and I grew them on sticks in the backyard, and those really did well for me. They're only 2 to 3 foot long beans. And I found out later, those were actually adapted to South Florida because they come from Southeast Asia, hot, humid, lots of bugs. So when they grew like crazy and they did well for me, I started to learn a little bit, about how having something adjusted to the climate actually gives you a yield rather than, all the information I had was from Yankee gardeners. Even my great grandfather up in upstate New York, he told me, he's like, "Oh, just put some lime on the ground and plant these beet seeds and they ought to do well for you." And none of that did well for me. It was like beach sand, and it didn't hold any organic matter. And I didn't know it then, but trying to annual garden in South Florida, you really have to think differently about it. You have to really pick different things, because what South Florida wants to be is tropical rainforest. If you go into an area where it's just been overgrown, it's all these crazy ornamentals that have escaped. You've got these giant strangler figs and wild palm trees and ferns, and half of the stuff is like what they sell for as house plants further north. All these creeping ivies and various colocasias and other stuff. They just invade and they make a tropical rainforest. But if you cut it all down, you just have hot, baking sand that kills tomato plants. So that's how I got started. I just killed plants for a long, long time until I started to not kill quite so many.
Well, I love that story because, first of all, I know tons of kids, including myself, who can relate to not sitting still in class, just wanting to be out in nature, catching frogs and just watching seeds grow. And, it's a shame that you didn't have more guidance and more information to maybe accelerate your learning curve when you were a kid. But talk to me about the journey, the learning that did happen for you, and how you started to have success in your garden and beyond.
When I was 15 or so, my grandmom and grandpa, they lived right down the road from us. They were less than a mile from our house, and they had a house that was on a canal. And if you're on a canal in South Florida, there are land crabs that like to live near the water, and they dig holes in your lawn and they make these little burrows. When we lived down in the Caribbean, they were regularly caught and eaten, but people didn't really do that in South Florida that I know of. So the land crabs would dig holes in my grandpa's yard, and he had a few coconut palms that were growing in the backyard. And he would take the coconuts and he would put them down into the burrow of the crab's nest and kick them down in the ground and say, "There, go build somewhere else." So he would block up the holes with coconuts. And then after a while, the coconuts would often sprout, and he would pull them out and he'd throw them into the underneath his hedge, and it was this constant battle he had against the crabs because they were messing his grass up, which is just funny because he was right. There was a seawall, and then there's this little strip of grass behind his swimming pool. They had a swimming pool, which was awesome. All my friends would go to my grandparents' house, but they would dig these holes. The land crabs would come in, and nature was trying to turn it back into the swamp that it had been, in the 1950s or 40s, before it had been drained in that area, and they built all these mid-century modern little block houses. And so I thought it would be really cool to grow coconut palm. There was a pile of sprouted nuts because he would both kick them into the holes, and anytime they fell, he would throw them back there because they didn't really even harvest the coconuts. They just existed. It was, again, like somebody had planted them previously, and when they fell, they were just a nuisance. So they would just throw the nuts underneath the hedge along the edge of the property. So there was always a pile of sprouting coconuts there. Now, when I look back at it, I'm like, man, if I had had the forethought to have a plant nursery back then, I could have just stuck all of those sprouting coconuts in pots and sold them by the side of the road. But I didn't.
Later.
Like, I could have propagated those. I could go back in time.
They'd be so big by now.
I know. So I took one of those coconuts home with me and put it in a pot. And I asked my dad, I was like, "Dad, can we plant this in the yard?" And he's like, "I don't know where that would go in the yard. I don't know." And I said, well, somewhere in the backyard. I mean, is there any spot? I don't know. No. So finally he gets around. He's like, "Dave, I guess if you wanted to plant one, you could plant it next to the shed back there. But if it gets in the way or anything, gets too big or causes problems, we'll have to cut it down." I was like, "Oh, okay." So I planted it. And I kind of knew that once something existed, my dad didn't like to change it. So once it was the way it was, he would just get used to it being there. So it was okay. So I planted that coconut palm in the ground. And then, I got older and I went to college and I moved out of the house, moved to Tennessee for a while, moved back to Florida, got married, had all these different things along the way, but all the time that coconut palm was just growing and growing and growing. It was adapted to South Florida. It likes the sandy soil, and it was very happy to be there in the backyard. So after about 6 to 8 years or so, it started making coconuts. And now, let's see, 28 years later or so, it's this gigantic tree. It's always got coconuts all over. It's way taller than the shed. It wasn't a gigantic variety of coconut, and it's probably reached near its maximum height, but it's probably 25 feet or so, and it always has coconuts on it. Meanwhile, the little garden that I planted, where I had my lettuces and my cucumbers and beans and everything, that's long gone. You can't even tell that there was ever a garden, ever any kind of annuals back there. But that coconut is still there. It's like that's a generational garden, and that also, that taught me something too, and that is when you grow something perennial that belongs in the climate, once you've got it, you've got it. Generally, it's if it's adapted and it likes it there, it's going to live a long time. And the area where my garden used to be, now my mom still lives there, and my sister's put a plaza of stones over it, and they use it for a little sitting area. And there's no more garden. Of course, I gave him a hard time about it. I was like, you guys should be planting food there instead of sitting around, but it's a really nice plaza. So they have people over and sit there. But just the learning that long-term perennials, if I could go back in time to when I was young, I would say plant more trees back there. I didn't get back there to plant trees again until I was in my 30s. In my early 30s, I told my dad, I said, Dad, I would love to be able to experiment in that backyard again. And at this point, I lived in North Florida, so we were about 5 hours north, where it freezes, where you could grow peaches, but you definitely can't grow mangoes. And I would love to have a more of a tropical research station and plant some trees down there. I said, that coconut's doing so well. And Mom planted a little mango back there. I said, why don't we plant more? And he says, I don't know. I've been trying to take care of the grass back there, but my knees are not very good. I said, Dad, you won't have to mow. He's like, oh, yeah. So we just put trees back there. I said, yeah, we'll plant a food forest back there. So starting in 2011, we started planting a food forest, and we had the one mango that Mom had planted, and then we had the coconut palm, which was way above it. And we started planting out from all of that and making islands and little pathways and ground covers. And now looking at it, 12 years, 13 years after we started it, the amount of food that comes out of that backyard for a tiny amount of work. I mean, if I had known back then, again, if I'm going to live into my 40s. So I could have planted so much stuff back then that would be just massive. Right now, the entire yard would probably be dark with fruit trees. But yeah, it's like having parents that gave me a little bit of backyard to experiment in, and then I actually continued experimenting, coming back to the yard in my 30s and starting another garden again. It's almost like the millennial thing, you're supposed to live in your parents' house. I didn't live in my parents' house, but I still garden in their backyard, and there's nothing wrong with that.
Well, so in this realization that you have to pick things that are adapted and do well in your climate already to avoid unnecessary work, and then in your case, really favoring perennials and going for things that, they want to live there. They don't require a ton of extra maintenance is really what I've gotten to know your content and your messaging from. And how has that informed the kind of myth busting that you often do about what is required to set up a garden or required to set up a food forest or an orchard?
That's a good question. My wife has said that my gift is sort of translator to normies. So I'll read a lot of complicated and annoying agricultural texts. I read the new books that come out, but I also read old books. I've read, Roman books on agriculture, and I've read annoying, like, just these scientific studies on propagation, and looked at very complicated systems. I've interviewed people that have aquaponics systems. I've gone and looked at farms up in the mountains of the Caribbean where the farmers are basically illiterate and are growing more food than the people with the aquaponics systems are growing down in the valley at their experimental station. It's like you've got the guy who gets up in the morning and he smokes some marijuana and he takes his hoe and a bag of roots and he goes and he plants a hillside by the afternoon with just like the machete, the hoe, the roots, and then he goes and he drinks rum, and he's got so much food coming out of that area because he actually understands how the climate works and when to plant and what likes it there. and and I think we have this huge tendency to make things overly complicated. And I actually get very frustrated reading all the scientific stuff because they're often very disparaging of the results of backyard gardeners and are the knowledge of people that are not peer-reviewed scientist types, right? Like if you ever read, there's a book called Buffalo Bird Woman's Garden, where she recounts how her tribe up in, I believe it's in Minnesota, how they would grow food before the white settlers came and everything changed and kind of fell apart for them and they got relocated. And the level of agricultural information they had passed on generationally for a very long time was excellent. And it was not, peer reviewed by people in offices. It was reviewed by whether or not you starved to death. And that's there's a huge motivator. As Nassim Taleb, he's a writer. He wrote the book Black Swan, Anti-Fragile. He's a writer and philosopher, and he talks about having skin in the game. If you're just able to go out and buy a solution to everything very easily, you've got a garden hose, you've got a tiller, you've got a bag of fertilizer, you've got fire ant pellets to kill the fire ants, and then you've got a pellet smoker. You've got all of these things. You just buy the solutions and then you tell people the best way to garden. You don't really have skin in the game. Meaning, are you going to lose any of your skin? Are you going to get hurt if this does not work out well for you? No, not really. Because you've got another job. You're not relying on it. So a lot of my gardening goes back to what would people do before they had a garden hose, before they had a bag of fertility they could go and buy down the street, before they had complicated systems like your aquaponic systems. If you couldn't get PVC, if you need PVC to garden, there's something wrong. You really don't need that. Yeah. A lot of these things are helpful or useful. Like it's really useful to have a tractor or to have a neighbor that comes and tears out a whole area. If a neighbor takes his tiller through and tills the whole front yard over for you, and you immediately go and plant potatoes in it, and then you keep it up and hoe that grass down and keep it, and then you build it over time. There's nothing wrong with that. But the anti-fragile systems, the skin in the game systems is it going to be able to feed you if everything shut down? Do you need it to be this complicated? Do you need to have a compost tumbler, or can you pile organic matter on the ground? Do you have to have an exact 24-to-1 ratio of carbon to nitrogen, or can you just throw things on the ground? Are these things absolutely necessary? No, they're not. I have people like throwing conniptions, total fits, because I have a bottom on my compost pile. I cast a slab and I put a big 3-bin composting system in my backyard. Do you need that to compost? No. Is it helpful when you're running a plant nursery to be able to process a lot of waste coming out of, like, we'll get peanut waste from a peanut processing facility, and we'll get restaurant waste, really sloppy stuff, really kind of higher carbon stuff, mix it together in layers, make these gigantic mounds. They're like 7-foot by 7-foot bays. It's really, really useful. But somebody goes, why would you? You have a bottom on that compost pile. The worms won't get in it. It's like, no, worms can crawl the walls if they want to. I had a worm bin indoors and I put a half a watermelon in it and it got too swampy. The worms climbed the walls of my house. I've seen this. It's crazy. They can get into anything. Is it really necessary? No, but it's very helpful. So you're always kind of balancing these. How practical is it? It may become practical if you are going to turn it with a tractor bucket to have a bottom on it. It's also very practical if you're trying to compost around trees. Because if you have a tree, when I was down in the tropics, I made a compost pile underneath the tree and the tree roots would just fill it up. So I took some old galvanized sheeting and I threw it on the ground, and then I made my compost pile on top of it, and the tree roots didn't get into it. And the tree roots grow very fast in the tropics. Nothing ever stops growing in the tropics.
Yeah.
If you stick a stick in the ground, it grows. Like your broom will grow. So,
I have
it's
experience
like
with that.
it's crazy. So, getting hung up on the complex systems is there's a lot of different ways to do it. So the idea is you're going to take a bunch of complicated information and you're going to strip out what you don't need and use what you can. So trying to make blanket statements like raised beds are the only way to garden or the best way to garden, or I never till, or we're only going to plant perennials. I only think food forests are the way to go. All these things they're very location dependent. It's like when God dropped man on the earth, it's sort of a choose your own adventure world where you can do something like you can plant a pear seed and you can get a tree that is 60 foot tall. But if the tree was about 10 feet tall and you cut it in half, and then when the new branches came, you could bend it sideways and you could grow it along a wire. Or you could take 3 pear trees and plant them in the same hole. Or you could graft different ones on there. Or you could breed pears together. It's like there were all these little hidden unlockable things that were left for us to find.
All these cheat
Somebody
codes,
starts
yeah.
digging. Yeah, exactly. So you start digging and you find some sort of shiny something in the side of the mountain and you realize you can hammer it out really well. It's like, oh, that's gold. Let's call that gold. That's really useful. So you start finding there's stuff buried beneath our feet that we can use. People have this idea that, the soil is just this thing that holds the plant roots. But the more they study the soil, the more they realize that it's so infinitely complex, you can't even get to the bottom of it. The amount of life that's in it, they can't even identify most of the organisms that are living in the soil. We don't know what they do. The idea of genetics being just purely like, well, if you have this and you have this, then you're going to get this. It doesn't really work that way. There's not only genetics. They thought that there was a bunch of junk DNA left over from evolution, but the more that they're finding, they're like, that isn't even junk. That's more storage. And things get switched on and off depending on your environment. The granddaughter may be different because the grandmother ate this particular food. I mean, it's like there's so many layers of complexity. What you have to do is you have to start stuff in your backyard and say, did this work for me in my backyard? And your gardening book kind of gives you a head start, like, well, you got to water things, you got to feed things, sometimes, and this, that, and the other thing. But it's not the full story. Really, you get much more from throwing a bunch of genetics at the backyard and trying 5 or 10 different methods, and then sorting out which methods work well in your climate and for your situation. So I'm always telling people, take your backyard and experiment with it. You don't have to go to peer-reviewed journals or whatever. Just does it work? If you want to know which tomato variety grows in your backyard, go buy 10 packets of tomato seeds, plant them all. Don't take good care of them. The ones that survive and give you tomatoes are the variety that you should save seeds from.
Yeah.
So you've just done $12 of tomato seeds have just taught you which tomato variety likes your yard. Another way you can, another cheat code is to go find any old gardeners that are in your neighborhood and ask them, what are the 5 easiest things that you grow around here? Or what works well for you? They'll be like, oh, I've grown this type for years and years and years, and it's always really easy. Then grow that. Yeah. What was commercially grown in your area? If there was something that was grown in your area commercially before it turned into a city, that probably grows well because farmers had skin in the game. If they did not make money off of what they were growing, they would not grow it. If they went bankrupt, they moved and that industry disappeared. Sometimes you'll have an industry that booms for 5 or 10 years and then there's a big freeze and it dies out. And the town might be called, Citrus, Georgia. And it was the citrus capital of Georgia for about 5 years. And then it's gone because they discovered, in the Great Freeze of 1847, that didn't work anymore.
Yeah.
So you could kind of like somebody's probably made the mistake before in your area, and that's your cheat code. But otherwise, you just experiment all you can, and then whichever survives, that's what you're supposed to grow.
Yeah.
Just let it grow.
And I really like the way that you painted a picture of the infinite complexity as well as optionality when it comes to growing and managing a landscape. These are living dynamic systems with billions of years of genetic information, adaptation, and possibilities locked within this, tiny little form of life in a seed or in a cutting. And we don't have to know all of the mechanics and the science of how it works to be able to interact with it as stewards, as propagators, as, gardeners, for lack of a better term. And rather than trying to micromanage things, there are these shortcuts. There are these patterns that we can tap into in order to be effective and reach our goals when we're growing or we're stewarding a space. And so what are some of the most tried and true, I guess, patterns or rules of thumb or cheats that you have found that will get you started on this road of experimentation and then figuring out the details of what works in your specific area?
It would have been about 2010 or so. We bought a piece of property in north central Florida. It was a different climate from where I grew up. I'd gardened in Tennessee for a few years there on a job, about 6 years in Tennessee, and then I had done most of my early gardening in South Florida. So now I'm at this place that's not quite tropical and it's not quite temperate. The summer would get up to 100 degrees. The winter, we recorded an overnight low of 12 degrees. That's a horrible swing. That,
You're basically
just to say that it's zone.
That's exactly the swing of temperatures that
Yes.
we get from winter to summer. I feel your pain.
It's terrible, right? So it's brutal. It's abusive weather. So I was trying to figure out what really grew there, and I planted a bunch of mango seedlings, and they all died. I planted jackfruit seedlings. They actually came back 2 or 3 years in a row before they died. But I was like, wow, we're only about 10 frost days from being able to grow papaya and key limes and maybe even coconuts up here. But when it frosted there, it would swing so immoderately below, it would be 70s, 80s, and then you get an overnight low at 18. And then by mid-morning, it's 40. But that was enough to kill all those papayas that you've been growing for a year.
Yeah.
They, like I was talking about
my previous weekend. That's exactly what happened.
It's terrible, right? I mean, and you just when things start to look like they're swinging up, and then you get another one last hit of frost and just blows all the blooms off of everything.
Yeah.
So
I've got the pictures of all of the new blossoms from many of the fruit trees in the area covered in snow.
Oh, that's awful. Yeah.
It's heartbreaking.
Yeah, we had that last year. Last year here, I'm in lower Alabama now, just north of the Florida border. And we had weather in December that was in the 80s, everything's nice and friendly, and then it dropped down to 16, and it had 2 days where it never rose above freezing. But after being in the 80s, that's just ridiculous. And then you get in the spring, everything warmed up, and the trees that hadn't been killed or damaged too badly by that, it warmed up in March. Near the end of March, we got an overnight low in the mid-20s after it had been warm for an entire month. Every tree had bloomed. Everything had fruit on it. It had fresh new green growth shooting out everywhere. And then this cold just took it all off. I had a mulberry tree that was almost 10 feet tall, and it froze down to about 1.5 feet.
Oh.
So when I was in north central Florida, I was really getting serious about my garden because I had started a business. The business hadn't done that great. I did not have that much money. I did well for 1 year, and then I did really bad the next year, and then I slightly recovered. And we were able to buy a closure house because the housing market just absolutely cratered Central Florida. These houses had been running, in the 300,000 range, and they went all the way down to like 75 to 100,000 in the course of 2 years. I mean, and that's where we bought it. We bought it at the bottom. Now, of course, if I had kept it, I would be rich now, but I sold it. So that's the way it always goes. You buy and you're like, I buy it only, but whatever.
Yeah.
So God doesn't want me to be rich. He wants me to be humble, I think. So anyhow, we were looking at this climate. I'm going, okay, so it sees frosts, but it also has really brutal, warm, hot summers. And I had been reading some of these permaculture guys. Toby Hemingway had got a garden recently, and we had moved. And I had watched Jeff Lawton's Establishing a Food Forest the Permaculture Way. I'm like, compost. And I'm like, wow, I love this, like this food forest idea. And I said, I'm gonna plant my food forest. And I threw a bunch of peaches in the front yard. Couple peaches, couple plums, few citrus, and just started sticking things out and seeing what would happen. And they didn't really do all that hot to begin with. They didn't grow that much. It was too hot, or it was too dry, or something, or I didn't care for them enough. The soil was not very good. And I started looking at what is our climate. We share some in common with the Mediterranean, except we get a little bit too much rain. But crops that grow in the Mediterranean, probably some of them would do pretty well in Central Florida. So we found we've got some figs and we got some pomegranates. Pomegranates did not like it that much. There are some varieties that do okay. They tend to make really ugly fruit in Central Florida, but they're still good. It's just they get spots all over them because it's so humid. You don't get those beautiful red pomegranates. You get things that look gross with little like brown spots all over them. The inside's still fine usually. So, and I was like, okay, so that we're that zone 8, 9 around the world. And then I started getting into Central American vegetables, malanga, cassava. Then it's like some Southeast Asian stuff, and Okinawa spinach and longevity spinach and katuk, some of the stuff that like the heat. And I was trying to figure out like how far up would the tropical stuff push, and how far down would the temperate stuff come? Like if something said it was 8 or warmer, sometimes like gooseberries technically are supposed to grow in zone 8, but it would get so hot in the summer that the bushes would just burn and die.
Mm-hmm.
Like they just gave up. And other things that were supposed to be zone 10, if I planted them underneath a fruit tree, they would live. Like a friend of mine had planted a bunch of pineapples in his greenhouse, and he got tired of getting spiked by the pineapples every time he went past them. He says these are really annoying in the greenhouse because they kept cutting him every time he was going and harvesting. There's pineapples everywhere, and they clump, like they make babies along the sides, and they keep spreading. So he took a ton of them out, and he threw them out of the greenhouse at the base of a live oak. 2 years later, they were still alive. They rooted into the ground at the base of the live oak, and they continued to grow, even though they were outside of the range of pineapple. And the bulletins on growing pineapple say pineapple is a full sun plant, but they were making pineapples for him in the shade in an area where it occasionally got down into the teens because of the thermal mass of that giant oak trunk and the canopy making a microclimate. So he learned that it would work. So we were trying to push up some stuff from further south and bring some stuff down from up north, and we looked around the globe. Well, I mean, some of our audience across the flatness of the earth before you get to the ice shelf. So we looked at similar climates and said what plants grow there, and we brought them and we tested them. Jicama and Mexican tree spinach and calabazas squash and all kinds of different things, and we stuck them all over the yard. And basically, whatever really took off, we would grow more of, and the stuff that was annoying and would fail for a couple of years in a row, we would get rid of. Like you're saying, there's variability every year. You don't exactly know what you're going to learn, but you can kind of find trends.
Yeah.
Like this one did really well this year, and it did really well the next year, and we had different conditions in both years. I think this is probably pretty good here. So a couple of years pretty much tells you, okay, that's good. So we found that African yams did way better for us than white potatoes did. The white potatoes tended to get eaten by fire ants, and it got pretty hot pretty fast, so you couldn't grow long season potatoes that make a ton of potatoes. You had to grow the fast determinate types, 90-day potatoes, 80-day potatoes. And but our African yams would grow all the way through the summer, and they have a vining. They're all these Dioscorea species that climb up on trees. They're actually one of the varieties was on the invasive species list. It grew so well. And if it's on the invasive species list and it's edible, that means that it's suited to your climate. It's probably more than suited to your climate. So we ended up kind of retooling, and instead of planting the stuff necessarily recommended by gardening books, if you get a book on Florida gardening, generally the Florida gardening books are all about how you can try to keep Yankee crops on life support. It's not about how you can grow plants from Puerto Rico that would actually love it. It's about how can you grow the familiar crops of Europe in this climate. Like, how early do you have to plant your sweet corn? Maybe you're just not supposed to grow that much sweet corn, or maybe it's too much trouble, or maybe your summer squash getting drilled by vine borers means you should be growing a cucurbita machata that's more adapted to the tropics and just pick the fruit when they're young, or grow a Lagenaria cicera, like any of the bottle gourd family. The Cucuza squash, they grow like weeds. They're like gigantic. I won't say the Z word because this is a family-friendly channel, but they're like a giant cucurbita peppo that's green. But you can cut them into pieces, Sorry, I can't stand that stuff. Mom made me eat it when I was a kid. I refuse to say it on my channel. I will not answer questions regarding that. That's not a vegetable.
It's like the Voldemort of the gardening world.
Don't say the name.
Don't say it.
Summon it. If you look in the mirror and you say it 3 times. Yeah. So I started planting this stuff, and I didn't really take that great a care of all of it. I wanted to see how it would do, and I'm kind of lazy in my gardening sometimes. I don't necessarily go out to the garden every day and pull weeds, and that also kind of lets genetically what is supposed to be in your area. If you don't take great care of it and still makes you food, that's my kind of crop. And that also fits with most people's actual lives. I mean, most people are not farming for a living or farming for their food full time. Backyard gardeners want to get some food out of there, and people that are more prepper or survival oriented, they want to make sure that they have calories in the ground. But generally, the vegetables that are being grown won't even really fill you up. You get a canister of seeds, and it's from the survival seed bank, and you keep it underneath your mattress, with your beans and your block of gold and your Ron Paul Revolution sign, all that's right. So you've got all this thing, like this talisman right here is going to save me. If the grid collapses, I'm going to pop this thing open, and I'm going to grow Cherokee purple, black seeded Simpson, golden wax bean. It's like, no, if you don't know what you're doing ahead of time, you're not going to have much food. And also, lettuce is not going to fill you up. Lettuce and greens, forget that. Like,
that is rough.
You need meat and potatoes is what you need if you're going to stay full.
Yeah.
So
carbohydrates and fats and proteins. Yeah.
Right. So first of all, we figured out what plants liked our climate by just planting tons of stuff, and the stuff that didn't die and the stuff that thrived, we kept growing it. This turned into the book, Totally Crazy Easy Florida Gardening. Because after about 5 years of doing this, I was like, wow, it's actually really easy to grow food now. We can grow 1,000 pounds of food in the backyard. That was kind of the goal. Can we grow 1,000 pounds of food in the backyard without working that hard at it? And we figured it out. Meanwhile, we had the food forest going around the edges. So over time, that was maturing and bringing in more and more food every year and all kinds of surprises. Every time we had something that we found that looked interesting, we would tuck it into a gap. And if it lived, it lived. And if it died. But we found out that if we replace our white potatoes with malanga, which is taro, if you're not familiar with malanga, taro.
Yeah, we grew malanga when I had the farm in Guatemala. That was one of our main crops. Yeah.
So as long as you got a wet spot or somewhat moist spot,
basically your swamp carbohydrate. Yeah.
I mean, they're invasive in parts of Florida too. There's areas where you're past like all these elephant
varieties of them as like ornamentals. Yeah, they like the big leaves that look like elephant ears and the different colors that can come from them. I mean, that's some really high quality starch there.
It's very, very good. And when you cook it, it's delicious. It's almost like dumplings,
Well, you
you
definitely
know?
have to cook it, right? It's kind of poisonous if you don't.
Oh yeah, it'll tear you up if you don't cook it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I knew somebody that had some
Caveat.
growing in their yard and it didn't work out well for he said the people that were here before said you could eat these elephant ears. So I think she like stir fried them or something, and he almost went to the hospital with his throat swelling
Oh
up
my
because it
goodness.
makes all those graphite crystals. That's not cool.
Yeah,
But
make sure you know
yes,
what you're
really cook it.
consuming and growing when you're experimenting with new things in your area. That's it's also worth
Yes.
knowing.
Otherwise, you're going to find out that you were the one that wasn't adapted.
Yeah, exactly.
You just call
Major
yourself out
learnings
on
this year.
accident.
Yeah. I didn't survive. I was not adapted to this season.
I learned something this year. I died.
Well, so look, one of the things that I was noticing in this list of things that has worked out for you and some of the principles that you could apply is what was missing from that, which is not a lot of information on how to manage the fertility of your soil. Not a whole lot of information on the amount of watering that different plants needs. And this is really something that I've been exploring on the podcast for a while now through interviews with people like Joseph Lofthouse and Shane Simonson. I know you did an interview with for Going to Seed podcast, is that sometimes your terrible conditions are the perfect growing environment for something that you hadn't considered. And much like you were saying a second ago, is like we are very limited from this kind of common globalized diet based mostly on Northern European or Mediterranean crops, which
Right.
should not be applied everywhere, do not do well in, let's say, most of the world's terrestrial surface, and shouldn't be the base of the diet for everybody across the world. And when you start to open up to what naturally grows in certain areas, what were the traditional diets of different places, you don't need to go into creating this perfect chocolate cake, crumbly, high organic matter soil with perfect irrigation needs. What you open up is all of the possibilities with exactly the unique difficulties of your area and what the potential of those are. So beyond this,
Hmm.
minimal effort, looking to see what grows well, let's go into one other side of this, which you alluded to earlier, which is saving seed and how you can start to adapt the things that maybe aren't great in the beginning, or even improve the ones that are doing decently when you get started. Let's talk about that process of saving
Yes.
seed, breeding, landrace gardening, which you also are big into.
Yes. And you mentioned Joseph Lofthouse. He was very, very influential. I didn't read him until 2 years ago. I got a copy of his book. Somebody said, "You got to read Joseph Lofthouse." I read his book. I was like, this guy is my brother from a different mother. And I ended up getting I mentioned him in one of my videos, how much I had enjoyed his book, and I plugged it. I'm like, get this book. This is fantastic. It's very helpful. Like because it opened just a I was already kind of on the edge, but then mixing all the heirlooms together and throwing them at the ground and then seeing which ones survive, I was like, yeah, yeah, he's done it. He's gone much further into the seed saving angle of it, whereas I was just looking more at species, and he's further into like tweaking the species to actually fit. So, backing up a little bit to soil and ecosystem. First, somebody wrote me about a year ago and said, "We bought this piece of land. It's down in the Florida Panhandle. What do we need to do to make it into like we want to build a food forest and we want to grow this and we want to grow that and I said, where are you located? I was like, there, we're in such and such. I said, I think that's mostly pine land. And I said, do you have any pictures? So they sent me some pictures and I got the address and I did a Google Street View and I drove past their house on Google Street View. My kids think it's hilarious. You drop the little man from the air and
Yeah.
he just falls on the ground and then you're in a neighborhood,
What a tool.
And it's really handy. So I'm looking along the sides of the road and I see there's grass along the sides of the road through that along the highway where this is located. The grass has patches of sand showing through it everywhere, like eroded patches of sand. The grass looks horrible. There's a neighbor and their yard is they've got a mowed yard with a couple of trees in it, but it's not really a yard. It's like patchy sand weeds. It's horrible. And I wrote them back and I said, okay, this soil is not suitable for most agriculture. I said, everything you do up here is going to be completely uphill because this is a very specific ecosystem. This is pine land. I said, your undergrowth is probably gallberry. I said, you may have a few wild blueberries. You may have a lot of wild blueberries, depending on if they have worked their way in there or not. I said, you probably got yapon holly. I said, this is fast draining, horribly acid. And I said, it's a reason that they farm pines here. I said, historically, this was not a great place for farming. If it liked acid, you could do it, and you could run landrace varieties of cattle through there. That would work. You could run goats through there. You could lime the area real good and make some pasture out of it, and then the cows, regeneratively graze it up into something. I said, but really, as soon as you cut the trees down, I said, if you look at the neighbors' yards, I said, it's patchy sand and grass. I said, the drainage and the acidity, I said, you're just going to be fighting geology the entire time. I said, so you might have to rethink what you're growing. Like they're like, we want to grow apples and we want to grow plums, and it's like, if you dug those into the ground there, they would stay at the same size for the next 5 years if they lived, and then they would die. Like they are just not going to like it there. It's very sad, but this is what you got. If you're going to plant a blueberry farm, you might do all right, but you're going to have to think about that too, because if you buy the homestead, you're buying the soil. And there's kind of the Elaine Ingram camp where like any soil in the world can definitely be good, and it's just a matter of having the right microlife in the soil. And there's some truth to that. I'm not completely and utterly convinced that any soil is going to work that way, but you can definitely make it better. But you're starting with something that is really difficult. So yes, there's a guy who calls himself Florida Bullfrog. He's on YouTube. And I have been working with him on a book on landrace chickens. He has landrace chickens. He has that piece of that really awful scrub. He said it's so hard to garden there that he just switched to having chickens be his main source of food. And he eats wild greens, and he grows small patches of garden that he has the chickens work and turn the soil and manure it, and then he gets enough fertility to grow some crops, but just small patches of vegetables. But he eats a lot of chicken and he eats a lot of eggs. And he said historically that's what his ancestors did. They actually released the chickens into the woods, and the ones that lived and kept breeding. And then he said we had no idea how many chickens we had. The uncles would have, like, they were into cockfighting and everything, like way back when he was a kid. And he said, so they had all these wild, scrappy game birds that could fight off the foxes and all of the other things that are all hungry because there's nothing to eat in those pine lands, So he had basically chickens that were living in trees around their old Florida cracker house, and they would go out there and they would shoot a couple when they wanted a chicken dinner, and they would tack up boxes on the trunks of trees, and the birds would jump up in there and lay their eggs because it was a little dark spot with a little hay in it. And he said that was mostly what they did to eat off of. And you'll find, like, in that area, people hunted and they ate meat and they ate some berries and stuff, but it was not like, this was not land that was beautiful rows of cabbages and corn and that kind of stuff. It's poor soil. So you have to have animals that are actually adapted to live on it. The animals eat the limited undergrowth, and then people would eat the animals. That's historically how they were living. So, if you're starting with something like that, now going back to land racing, yes, do what you can to improve the soil some, and then throw as many varieties as possible at it and see which lives. He did it with chickens, but you might try that with pumpkin varieties. I took about 15 different varieties of Cucurbita machata, which is that's the species that is butternut, which is the Southerners love to eat their butternut squash, and Seminole pumpkin, which goes to it's named after the Seminole Indian tribe, but it actually predates them. A little tough pumpkin that stores for as long as a year, and it roots very heavily along each node. So the bug pressure, if it kills one part of it, the other part of it keeps growing, and it manages to grow through the heat and produce. Whereas a lot of northern pumpkins, they get destroyed by bugs and they're gone. I've tried to grow Hubbard squash multiple times here, always gets killed on me. It's destroyed in a few months. It's all gone, and I rarely get a squash. Seminole pumpkins, I get a lot. So I planted a whole bunch of different varieties. The ones that live, we save seeds from, particularly the ones that just show up and self-seed and then grow themselves. Like if you feed some pumpkins to your pigs and then you move your pigs, that area there, the pumpkins will grow out of it and you'll get tons of pumpkins. Sometimes if you put them directly in the sand, you don't get that. So there may be some synergy going on there. But what Joseph Lofthouse does in his area of Utah, he tills the weeds under and plants crops, and he barely takes care of them other than irrigating. The ones that survive and make fruit, he replants the seeds from those, and he continually adds more genetics. And after a few years of this, he's got stuff that is productive even on his poor soil. So there's definitely a lot of potential there. And take what survives. When I was in Indonesia, I went and I was consulting with a ministry over there there was an Indonesian guy who was really good at installing these well systems and ram pumps. So he was putting water into villages that were, 2 miles from a good, clean water source. So they asked, after they had gotten some of these wells in, they said, would you come here and help us figure out how to grow some stuff? And I said, well, I'm not that familiar with the Indonesian climate or what their history of agriculture is or that sort of thing. But I said, but I'll look around. I'll help if I can. I said, I can't claim I'm going to be more expert than the farmers that are already there. But there was a school and they each had garden plots, and the kids paid a few dollars a month to be in this school. And they learned English, they actually it was a very nicely done school, but they didn't have power. They didn't have much running water. They had a well, and the kids had garden patches, and they would grow produce in the garden patches. They would get up really early before the classes, and they would grow their gardens, and they would sell the produce and give some of it to their families that lived in the village that was a couple of miles away. Out in that field, he was asking, like, what type of this would you grow? And what type of this would you grow? And he says, what type of tomatoes would you grow? Well, I was out in the field, and they had tilled this area under and killed off most of the grass and stuff, and they had been making these little garden beds. I came across a tomato plant that had tomatoes all over it. It was this shrubby, tough-looking little tomato, and this is a pretty dry area. This is in Timor. And this tomato was sprawling along the ground, and I said, did you plant that tomato? I said, just like out in the middle of the field. They were like, we're going to expand over here. And I said, did you plant this tomato? And he says, no, it just grew here after we tilled it. And I said, that's your tomato right there. I said, when those fruit ripen up, if they are any good, I said, save all of the seeds from them and replant that tomato. I said, you didn't do any work for this. You didn't irrigate it. I said, forget buying tomato seeds or named varieties from the city. I said, this right there is yours. I said, name it after your parents. It was his parents' field that they had donated to the school to use, and it was one of the teachers. And he said, my parents said we could use this field. I said, name it after your parents. I said, or whatever. I said, this is your variety. And I said, share seeds with everybody that's around here. I said, because this one, I said, nature has already selected one out for you. Who knows where it came from? No idea. Maybe there's a tomato field there some years ago or something, or maybe somebody was eating a salad out there. I have no idea. But that variety right there, that's the one you want. And so that kind of looking for what's already there. So I told this couple that had this poor soil, I said, what you're going to want to do is they said, we're going to clear this whole area. I said, be careful before you clear it. I said, clearing all those pines and everything out of there. I said, I understand you've got to get space for your house and that sort of thing. I said, but you may have persimmons there. I said, you may have wild blueberries there. I said, if you're really lucky, you might have some pawpaws. I said, you might have some edible cactus. I said, you might have some wild maypops. I said, you want to keep some of those Yaupon hollies. That's one of our native North American sources of caffeine. I said, there may be something in this ecosystem that you can already leave to start building your food forest around. I once looked at a piece of property for a prepper guy in Central Florida, and he had really sandy, poor soil, very scrubby. It was that yellowy white sand. I stepped over two pygmy rattlesnakes when I was out there. We spotted. I mean, it was just like, this is not a friendly environment. There's like a patch of weeds and then sand, and then another patch of weeds and then sand. And I noticed that there was a variety of mayhaw growing all over the place. And this mayhaw, it makes these little kind of astringent fruits that you can make jams out of. And I said, well, okay. I said, there's a fruit. I said, don't cut all those things down. I said, there's a little bit of food. At least you're going to feed the animals with it. You can make some jam out of it. I said, but also, I said, I think I remember mayhaw is compatible as a rootstock for pears. I said, I'm going to come back and bring some pear scion wood when it's the right time of year. And so what I did was I came back with pear wood and I grafted it onto some of the mayhaws that are already growing there. They're already adapted to the really hard soil. If I took a pear, grafted onto the normal pear rootstocks and planted it out there, it would probably hate it and it would probably die. Unless he took really good care of it, piled up the mulch, got his worms and his mushroom compost or whatever he was going to do, some boutique, kelp meal or whatever. I said, we'll just graft onto it. So we grafted onto the mayhaws, and the pear scions actually took and started growing out of the mayhaws. So if you have your wild persimmons, I said, if you find any wild persimmons out there, then you can go take your Japanese persimmons, graft them onto those existing ones, and get them to grow. In our yard, we have this invasive Bradford pear that's popped up all over the place. It's thorny. It makes a little hard fruit that's worthless. I mean, maybe some of the birds eat it, but they don't seem to eat much of it because they hang on it all winter and then they drop on the ground and they start more. It was originally an ornamental tree that escaped and has gotten uglier over time as it's gotten more wild. So a friend of mine started grafting onto his, and he grafted cultivated pears onto it. So last year we grafted onto the ones that are growing in our backyard. Now we've got great big, like 8 foot of growth from the last year because it was already an established, scrappy, weedy rootstock. We put something cultivated on top of it and grew it. So sometimes it's a matter of looking and seeing what resources are already there, what wants to grow in your soil that's already there, what plants are adapted to it. And if you don't really have much growing there to begin with, take a whole ton of genetics and throw it at it, and the stuff that lives is supposed to be there. If it gets all kinds of pest problems and they die on you, they weren't supposed to live there. So it's like, I'm not going to bother spraying everything. I'm going to plant a whole ton of stuff together, let it all fight, whatever lives. That's what I want. Now, if I was starving and I really, really had to have food, I would try to improve the soil for the highest fertility possible in the first year. So your land racing thing is good for your long-term experimentation. But like, say, we've got COVID-20 comes along and we're like, oh no, we've got, this one's even worse. In that case, you're going to save your own manure and urine. You're going to go out to the woods and sift compost from underneath the trees and mix it into your beds. You're going to get the highest fertility possible. You're going to grow all of your calorie crops first. Don't start with the lettuce and the tomatoes. Forget that. You want potatoes, or if you're more tropical, you want cassava and taro and yams and sweet potatoes. Grow grain corn. Forget sweet corn. Grow grain corn because you can store it. You can eat it. It's high calories. It fills you up. Get some chickens, that kind of thing. But you're going to grow as many calories as possible right on the front end. If it fills you up, if you can eat a salad and you're still hungry, that's not what you want. That's not what you want. That may be nice, but that is not going to keep you fed. The idea is to keep your stomach full so you can keep moving, you can take care of your family, and you can keep planting and farming because you're going to jump into it. So you build the fertility as high as possible and plant as many calories as possible. But that's just one of the tools you use. It's like, don't get hung up on the systems. I only do, like I said, I only do raised beds, I only do food forests, or do what else. Depending on the situation, you're going to switch, and you're going to be just as adaptable as your plants. Yeah. If you're doing something and it doesn't work, change.
Yeah, it's such, the stories in there illustrated so many of the things that I would have otherwise gone in individual questions. And I think that the principles here, just the basics of growing what grows well already where you are, no matter how challenging it is, no matter what the individual shortcomings of the soil or the temperatures or the frost dates or whatever it is, grow what grows like a weed where you are, and then build on from there. You can, over time start to adapt the seeds through saving. You can start to bring in different species and whatnot. But if you started that as a base, it takes away maybe 80% of the failures and the challenges that people have in the beginning. And honestly, I think it's one of the most overlooked solutions in the conversation around regenerative agriculture, which is a big point of conversation in my day job. is everyone's like, okay, how do we get to lower use of fertilizer and less pesticides? And how do we wean ourselves off of herbicides to control the weeds? It's like, well, if you try and grow something that is going to struggle under your conditions regardless, just because there's an established market for it or because your machinery can do it efficiently, you are always going to struggle. You're always going to need inputs and expenses that are going to cut into your profits and the viability of your business. I think, honestly, if more places and more people would just embrace the things that did well there, as well as what their cultures and their cuisines are based off of, instead of trying to grow the grocery aisle for your Italian cooking kink in the tropics, you would probably have a lot more success and something to build on, as well as something unique to offer that would make it fun to travel again instead of getting the same mealy, flavorless tomato in every single grocery store from Manila to Berlin. And so
That's right. That's exactly right.
yeah, and so
Yep.
I guess before we wrap it up today, can you tell our listeners, first of all, maybe just a couple of small points of advice to get them started in getting those successes, and then where they can find out more through the many resources that you have available?
Yeah, first of all, find those older gardeners in your neighborhood.
Mm.
If you can find anybody that's already growing, there's an old lady down the road that always seems to have a lot of tomatoes. That knowledge has been lost. Unfortunately, as we move through the Industrial Revolution, and particularly when women enter the workplace in droves in the 60s and 70s, a lot of the information was being passed on generationally. Like my great grandmother knew all about canning, she knew all about sewing, she knew all these home skills that had been traditionally preserved generation to generation. When the companies started breaking up the family and plugging everybody into office jobs, a lot of that traditional information was lost. We lost a piece of our heritage. So if you could find anybody that still has any of the heritage of your area, if you go to like historic reenactments where people are making sugarcane syrup the way they used to, or doing, beekeeping, or any of that kind of information. Well, what did they used to do? What did they used to do before you could buy a solution? Don't think the easiest thing is buy a solution. Somebody came over to my house the other day and borrowed one of my broad forks. I told her, I said, you could borrow this broad fork. And she says, oh, I only have a little patch. I'm going to borrow the broad fork. So she borrowed the broad fork. She came back, a week or two later, and she brought it back to me. And she said, it was so hard to use. My husband just went out and bought a tiller for me. I said, oh, really? I said, did you use one before? She's like, no, I just kept trying to jam it into the ground. It doesn't want to go in. So I said, oh, let me show you. She says, well, our grass is really hard. I stuck it in the sod and I stood on it and I rocked back and forth and rocked it into the ground. She's like, oh, that doesn't look that hard. And I said, I'm sorry. I said, I didn't realize that you didn't know how to use it. That little piece of information of you just rock on it and use your body weight and you tip back and you just put it 4 inches further back and you rock on it and tip it back. It looks like magic. It looks so easy when you see it. Yeah, but you hand somebody something that they don't have. I had somebody tell me once, I had my plant nursery booth and I had persimmon trees, Japanese persimmon trees. He comes by and he goes, what's that? I said, it's a persimmon. He goes, oh, I hate those. Those are the most awful fruit I ever tasted in my entire life. I said, really? He goes, it's like, oh man, made my tongue hurt. And I said, oh. I said, you got it too early. I said, our native persimmons, you get them too early. I said, they're very, very astringent. I said, it's terrible. I said, but when they're fully ripe, I said, they taste like honey and sunshine. I said, it is the most delicious fruit. It's the closest thing to a mango you can grow in our temperate climate. And he's like, really? I said, yeah. I said, you let it get fully ripe? I said, it's like sugar sweet. I said, besides, this is a Fuyu persimmon. It doesn't even have astringency. About 10 minutes later, he bought a tree from me. And I thought, if somebody handed me a banana and said, this thing's good to eat, I would try to take a bite of the end of it. Yeah. And if you've never seen anybody with a banana before, you bite the end of it off, feel like, oh gosh, it's got a little sweetness in it, but it's like nasty. Because you're eating the peel, you don't even know, right? So that's the big gap. So the first thing is go find somebody that's done it before. And if you go down to your extension office and ask them, I said, what used to grow here? What do people farm around here? I said, go to your feed store. Go to your feed store. What do the farmers grow around here? Now, of course, they might just be growing corn and soy, but what did they used to grow? Oh, they used to grow tons of potatoes for potato chips before it got cheaper to buy them from Idaho. Okay, well, good. You know you can grow potatoes. That's a good start. Drive around your neighborhood and see what gardens look good. Go see if there's any old fruit trees around the neighborhood. That gives you your first little bit of knowledge. If you could find any historic information on previous industries where people had skin in the game, what did the settlers grow? If there were indigenous peoples there, what did they grow? How did they grow it? There's a reason that single row gardening has lasted for so long. It's not because it's suited to, tractors driving through it. That helps, they plant it so they can drive tractors through it now. But the reason it was widely spaced and they grew grain, corn, etc. back in the old West was because it had to rely on rainfall. So maybe growing things really close together in a square foot garden is not right for you. Maybe you wanted to grow a lot of food, you space it way out. You got plenty of land, space it way out. You never have to water it. It's a different way to think. So start with that. And also don't be afraid to experiment. Don't be afraid to look stupid. Don't be afraid to do weird things that, stick it in the ground and see if it grows. I've known people that have wanted to grow food forests and they've bought potted trees and they've looked at videos and they've read books on food forests. If you read the 2-volume, the big 2-volume Food Forest Guide by Dave Jacke and Eric Tonesmeyer, it's got all of this technical information on old fields and succession, and it will make you want to yank your hair out. It's great information, but if you're just like, how do I start a food forest? If you get right into that technical literature, you may find that fascinating later, but no, you just need to grow food. Go out and plant a bunch of stuff in your yard, pace it off at randomly, 12 feet, 20 feet, whatever seems about right to you. If stuff gets too big, cut it down. Start a whole bunch of stuff from seeds and cuttings and plant it everywhere. Learn how to air layer, learn how to start stuff from cuttings. You could start 70 fig cuttings in like an hour. Cut a bunch of branches into pieces and dip them in some cheap rooting hormone and stick them in a pot and put a bag over the top of it to get a little bit of humidity, and then just ignore it for about 2 months and then plant them all over your yard. The ones that don't do well, cut down and feed them to the ones that do well. Just chop them into pieces.
This is exactly
just
what I did
rolling.
over last week. Yeah, so that's perfect advice because back where we used to live, there are tons of semi-wild figs just out in the middle of nowhere that nobody's taken care of in a long time. And between the walks around the neighborhood that I would do and my partner's parents who've lived there their entire lives, they know where all of the best fig trees around the neighborhood are. And that's exactly what we did. We got about 15 cuttings from all of our favorite ones, especially the ones that we know fruit early in the season, middle of the season, late in the season, in order to spread it out as much as possible. And you just described my task for tomorrow is putting those all in rooting hormone and putting them out both in the field and also in propagation to see what takes.
So don't wait until you've got it perfect and you've got all the information and you've got everything drawn and you've hired an architect and whatever, because you're not going to do it. A lot of times,
a whole bunch of savings so that you buy the perfect, already ready to fruit tree from the nursery that's got the tiniest little root ball. There's so many things that you don't have to do.
No, get it in the ground and just start planting. And remember that you can cut it down if you don't like it later. It doesn't matter that much, or prune it smaller. Things don't have to be 60 feet tall. Cut it down, and if it dies, well, it wasn't supposed to live. That's it. You are going to die one day. You have a limited amount of years in your life. You're not going to know everything that you need to know. The amount of knowledge that you have is just a tiny grain of sand. People are always telling me in my YouTube videos, "Oh, I didn't know you didn't know that. You've been gardening for so long." I'm like, I don't have all knowledge. If I had all knowledge, I would be God. I'm not God. I'm trying to figure this out a little bit at a time, like everybody else. But I have found, the worst decision is to just sit there and not make a decision. You're better off making a bad decision and then learning something from it and doing it again.
Go find 100 ways that will kill that plant and one that works and build from there. Like, you don't need to have all this academic knowledge and a bunch of perfect tools to get started. And I love that message. And so tell our listeners where they can find the books and the resources that you've put out there to give a little extra information to help them get started and find early success?
Sure. If you are into Florida gardening, I know a lot of you guys are not going to be from Florida, but if you like Florida gardening, I've written a few books for the state of Florida. I wrote Totally Crazy Easy Florida Gardening. I wrote Create Your Own Florida Food Forest, which is a great big fun guide to food forests. It's got 150 illustrations in it by 54 different artists. I had volunteer artists, so it's really cool. It's everything from little kids to like fantastic professional artists illustrated this book. It's beautiful. Create Your Own Florida Food Forest. And then I also wrote a book called Florida Survival Gardening, which is the crops that are high calorie, that are adapted, and high nutrition that are adapted to Florida if you were to garden with the utmost simplicity. I've also written the book Compost Everything, which is for everybody. You know, it takes composting, makes it simple. Grow or Die, the good guide to survival gardening. And I wrote a little book called Grocery Row Gardening, which is our current favorite gardening system, where we mix trees, perennials, ground covers, and we basically have little strips of food forest hedges that with paths in between, and you end up with a beautiful, vibrant, non-sprayed ecosystem where all the plants just fit into niches and grow us lots of food. Last year we got over 2,500 pounds of food out of our backyard, which is not a lot for a farmer, but it's a lot for a backyard gardener. And you know, you can also find my website. I have thesurvivalgardener.com, where I post every weekday. I have a gardening post. A lot of gardening blogs and everything have gotten really junked up. I don't know if you try to search for information on Google now, but you get a lot of junky SEO oriented, basically copy and paste from Wikipedia and AI written articles and things like that. We don't do that. It's just me. I write posts and I write what we're doing in our garden and how it's working. And it's the first thing I do when I get up in the morning at dawn. I bring my cup of coffee into the office and I write about what we're working on, and I always answer questions over there too. So if you got a question, go over to thesurvivalgardener.com and leave it in the comments and I will get back to you. You can also find me on YouTube, David the Good. I have a YouTube channel, and I don't necessarily get as in-depth on the YouTube channel as the books, but a lot of people like to see what's going on. And so YouTube is where you can see what my gardens actually look like, and if I'm just making all of this up.
Well, look, I can vouch those are awesome resources. They've given me tons of ideas, even though we've got a lot of differences in our climates and our growing conditions. But the ideas are really sound, and they've really helped me from the beginning when I was also like, I don't have gardening experience. Maybe I should just gather knowledge. And now you just got to get started. And this kind of stuff takes the anxiety out of it, takes the over planning out of it. And this is what's really going to grow food for you. So David, thank you so much for taking time today. It was awesome to finally connect with you. And there's so many more things that we can expand on. I would love to go more into plant propagation at another time. We're starting a plant nursery, but we'll leave that for another episode. And yeah, again, thanks so much for making time.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Thanks again to David. I've linked to his blog, his YouTube channel, and his Amazon bookstore in the show notes for this episode on the website at regenerativeskills.com. Now, before we wrap this up, just remember that these episodes are only the beginning of the learning resources, design and coaching services, in-person courses, and interactive community that are available through Regenerative Skills. The Discord server is our free community where you can connect with other like-minded listeners, exchange ideas, stories, tips, and resources, as well as interact with me directly and quite a few former guests from this show. Our Instagram account at regen_skills is the best place to see the projects that me and the team are working on, both for clients and collaborators, as well as on our own properties. I'll also be announcing the certification courses, workshops, and gatherings that we've got coming up later this year. If you're interested in getting dedicated support for your own project, you can now schedule a free planning session with one of our team members through the request form on our website. You can also find all the links, show notes, and past resources there at regenerativeskills.com. We truly believe that no matter your experience, your knowledge, abilities, resources, or background, you can be a powerful force for regeneration on this planet, and we're here to help you find your path. So as always, remember to keep taking those little steps every day towards a regenerative future, and I'll be right by your side along the way.